The Invasion of Eden with Paul Anthony Wallis. Was the Earth colonized by extraterrestrials? And if so, when will they return? Did they ever leave? What is the Bible really telling us? Well, let's talk about it with scholar Paul Anthony Wallis. This is part 2. And you're going to want to buckle up for this one. Let's go.
Hebrew language. Some scholars believe it's a loan word because it's just turned up from nowhere. But I argue in my books, The Eden Conspiracy and The Invasion of Eden, that Yahweh is in fact a sequence of sounds. And it's a sequence of sounds associated with draconic entities all around the world. The sequence of sounds in Yahweh can be found in languages from China, from Japan, from Nordic countries, Celtic countries. It is this repeating sound that repeats. It's in the Mesoamerican stories of Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Cucumats. It's the Cuchedra, it's the Cuchu, it's the Draconic, it's the Coca from Portugal and Spain. It's the Dracoch, is what I should have said. And then we've got the Holchis from out of Georgia and Achech from out of ancient Egypt. So I would suggest that Yahweh is not a name, it's a sequence of sounds, and it relates to a kind of being.
And I did want to give a huge shout out to our friends over at Noble Gold Investments. Do yourself a favor, call up Noble Gold Investments today. Find out how to convert your 401 or IRA into precious metals. You can also convert into cryptos. It's all about options. You can purchase gold and silver directly through Noble Gold Investments and have it shipped directly to your house, even if you live in the boonies. I have friends that have had gold shipped to their house in the middle of practically nowhere. So Noble Gold, A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, countless 5-star reviews. And if you look at where gold is going, oh yeah, we've recently reached all-time highs. I said at the beginning of the year, it might hit close to $2,500 or $2,500. And somebody said, no way, Rex. Well, silver, hot. There's a lot of upside with silver. Banks are still literally usurping tons of gold. So there might be some great opportunities for you, especially with all the turmoil right now. And if you don't have a 401 or IRA, no, just so you know, if you've got a 401 or IRA and you convert into precious metals, find out how to qualify to get a free 1/4 ounce solid gold coin added to your collection or to start your collection. Now, obviously, there's never any guarantees, but if you look at what the big banks and the money funders are doing right now, there is a ton of opportunity in the precious metals markets. Also, if you want to trade, like let's say that there is an SHTF scenario where you can't go to the bank and pull out money, or you can't use your debit card or your credit card, and you have to exchange. Some people like to have what I refer to as junk silver or silver dimes that were made 90% silver about 50 or so years ago and before that, because that's a great form of exchange. So dimes and nickels and quarters of 90% silver is a great option as well. And it's always nice to stack your bank. So give them a call, 1-877-646-5347. Let them know Rex from Leak Project sent you. And if you want to get the free ebooks and know more also, you can go to leakprojectgold.com. That's leakprojectgold.com. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Hello. Beautiful day.
I'm speculating that this sequence of sounds is the sound that these draconic entities made. And that's why the has been incorporated into their names by cultures all around the world.
Where do you get the Draconian connection?
Well, these entities that I just named, that all have the in their titles or names, are described physically by those cultures. So Yahweh, for instance, in the Hebrew scriptures, we are told he has a snout. We are told he has armor-like skin. We're told that he's feathered, and his flight feathers are referenced. We're told that he has a tail, and we're told that they didn't have any weapon that could pierce his armor-like skin. We're told that he either had equipment or could ignite his breath so that it becomes fire, and that was why he was so terrifying to human beings who'd never seen anything like this and were seeing their friends and family incinerated should they stand up against these entities. So, well, if you put all those together, that sounds rather like a dragon. And so that's why I say these beings are draconic beings all around the world. And these descriptors repeat around the world. I mean, if I say feathered serpent, that sounds like an impossible kind of being. We don't have feathered serpents, except we recognize that from the Mesoamerican stories. The feathered serpents were the powerful ones of those cultures. But the same correlations of behavior and physical attributes are there in the Bible, they're there in the Sumerian stories, they're there in African story, and told all around the world.
These things are like, or these beings are most likely very large, anthropomorphic, kind of like people, but much larger, and they've got on these technological suits. Or are we talking dragon, shapeshifter dragon? Like the David Icke kind of theory.
Yeah, could be either. And there are some texts where you will read the description of the dragons and think, hold on, that sounds like a craft. That sounds like a piece of equipment. So if I'm reading the Popol Vuh and I read about a dragon that travels through the night sky with a trail of fire behind it, so bright that it's brighter than the stars, okay, I think that's a machine. Or something that can incinerate a whole district. I'm beginning to think machine. But then there are other texts where it looks like a face-to-face conversation with some kind of an entity that says, no, reptilian entity. And I think all those may have been the case. I think it might have been all the above.
Yeah. Now, what about the possibility of these beings having more of a plasma type connection, some type of event that maybe took place in the heavens? I'm sure you've heard the electric universe theory, where there's thoughts that the Valley Marineris on Mars was actually created from some electric discharge when a planetary body broke orbit, possibly Venus, like similar to the aurora borealis that we might see. Maybe our ancestors saw an event that took place because there was so much electrical discharge that they etched that in stone. And then that was later deified into gods, and then also possibly extraterrestrials. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on that?
Yes, that's very interesting. Certainly when you listen to Mesoamerican story, it's easy to recognize that there are multiple layers to these stories. So on the surface, you've got this story of colonization by beings who just have more tech than us. And then beneath the surface, you've got some deeper stories about human origins. And then maybe beneath that, you've got stories that seem to suggest something very violent happening in the configuration of our solar system. And that there is some memory of the solar system being knocked around, built into these stories as well. And you talk about planetary events being commemorated and deified. Plato was on top of this 2,500 years ago. So I was rereading him recently, and he's very interesting when he uses the language of gods, because he says, I should clarify what I mean here. Gods can mean two things, he says. On the one hand, a god is a being more advanced than ourselves. And on the other hand, a god can be a planet that has been deified, to use that language. It's being related to as a deity because of the influence it has on conditions on planet Earth. Now, that's very interesting because today, planets don't really seem to have much of an observable impact on planet Earth unless you really have advanced astrophysics going. We're not aware of Saturn affecting us or Jupiter affecting us, and yet the ancients were. And so I think when you've got a body in the sky that's moving around and that is creating cataclysms on Earth, something that Plato says happens on a periodic basis, and threatens to take civilization back to a virtual zero, that's how dramatic the impact is, then of course you're going to be frightened of that object. Of course you're going to venerate that object and hope we don't offend it so that it comes back again. And I think that layer of memory is there in these ancient stories as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And it makes me think of, there's a tablet that I read from ancient Sumer that was translated from Oxford University. And I remember it said that the Anunnaki gods were prostrating themselves on the ground to the Great Thunderbird. And the Great Thunderbird, I am most likely is referring to either this planetary event that's unfolding, this major cataclysm, or some type of super high technology, possibly. But that's very, very interesting. And the SARS connection, when we go back to the Sumerian king list, and the kings would rule for SARS. If the SARS 3,600 years, there's got to be some significance to that. Why? Why would they rule for X amount of SARS? Your thoughts?
Yes. Why do you need a unit that big is really the question. And you're quite right. We know what a SARS is. It is part of the same counting system that we still use today, that we inherit from the ancient Sumerians. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. The 3,600 years is part of that counting system. But why do you need a unit that big? Is it just so that you can describe the anomalously long reigns of the Anunnaki kings on the Sumerian kings list? Or is it because you are tracking movements of objects in space that are on a much longer cycle than anything we see on the planet? And I think that may well be the reason.
Well, I guess time's going to tell on that. We'll see, folks, the 3,600 years. One of the things that I find fascinating is these like massive statues that are ancient on places like Easter Island and Hawaii. And I think you recently spent some time on an island of Molokai in Hawaii.
In the Invasion of Eden, that is where we go. That's where I take the reader to Molokai to listen to some of the traditional story there about the invasion of the Mo'o.
Ooh, give us an introduction to this.
Well, I was fascinated to learn these stories, and it's amazing. I find the moment I start out to write another book in the Eden series, the book begins to write itself. And the way this usually happens is that people come from out of the woodwork and begin gathering around me, and they come in waves from different groups to say, Paul, let us tell you our story because it relates to your research path. And this time around, it was friends from Molokai, from Hawaii, who wanted to tell me these stories. And the invasion of the Mo'o is very interesting. So again, these are draconic entities, and there are a couple of waves of draconic story all around the world, and those two waves are in the Mo'o story as well. There are those who come and help humanity and help us become a farming, civilization building force on the planet. And then there are those who come and annex and exploit. And both streams are there in the stories of the Mo'o. But what interested me as I listened to these stories that was really a light bulb moment for me was, why are they telling us these stories? Are they telling us just so we'll know how awful it was for them when the Mo'o came the second time, how bad things were in the past? If it's not just that, if they're wanting to equip us for understanding the present, then what are we supposed to look out for? And what the Mo'o stories say is, don't be looking out for anomalous engagement with craft in the sky. Don't be looking for evidence of Star Wars in space. Look for shifts in culture that seem to be moving your culture away from a place of harmony and happiness and love and compassion. Look for movements in culture that suggest everything is being machinized and the grassroots are being disempowered. Look for signs that it's becoming harder and harder to work for yourself and be self-sufficient or work for one another, that everyone's being forced into slaving for money, slaving for currency whose value they can't control. Look for a deflation of that currency on a systematic basis. Look at increased urbanization and increased detachment from the land for the ordinary population. These are all the kinds of signs you should be looking for. Like Robert Kirk said, look for policies that have no fellow feeling in them towards ordinary human beings. And as I put together all these therefores flowing from the story of the Mo'o, it reminded me of the sage words of President Eisenhower, who I think now the stories from Hayam Eshed really would seem to confirm Eisenhower was read in to the exopolitical world. He was aware of contact. He was involved in decisions around that. What did he do with his knowledge of this? He warned us about cultural shifts as well. He warned about cultural shifts that would move government away from managing in the interests of the welfare of the people so that everyone's got enough food, hospitals, schools, they're able to thrive as family units. Look for shifts away from that and look for shifts of power where government is now serving the engines of war and where the real engines of war, the military-industrial complex corporations, that's the aerospace industry, are really calling the shots in terms of geopolitics, that we are living either in a constant state of war or a constant state of paranoia because it helps those corporations to thrive. That is what Eisenhower said we should look out for. And I realized it really was a very pithy summary of the therefores flowing from the story of the Mo'o. So I connect all these dots in the invasion of Eden and say, well, what does that mean today? How far down that track are we? And are there any ways that we can improve outcomes for ordinary human beings moving forward once we know that there are ETs in the geopolitical mix?
Well, Paul, if you put it that way, it seems like they have a huge power control grid established within the fabric of the planet as far as the conditioning goes with the media and, as you said, the military-industrial complex and the political spectrum that is unfolding. How many hundreds of billions of dollars have been just signed off? Oh, yeah, another 100 billion.
Well, well, it's trillions.
I mean,
it's trillions. I mean, I think it's more than a decade ago we realized there was $9 trillion unaccounted for. Goodness only knows what that amount is today. And yes, it does suggest that there's a real stronghold that is very well established that has pushed things in an unhealthy direction. But the encouragement I derive from our ancestors' stories is that contact is going on not just among the higher ups of the aerospace industry, that there is in fact contact going on at every level of human society, and that our ET visitors are a little bit smarter than to travel interstellar distances and then think they're having a conversation with the whole of humanity if they've got a few elite members of the corporate world and military intelligence. And I think if we listen carefully, not only to ancestral story, but to experiencers and contactees today, there is contact going on at every level. The research they're doing into humanity is not just going on the say-so of the 1% of the 1%. We are being observed at every level. And I think that is something that ought to encourage us rather than worry us, because their understanding of the welfare of human beings is far more holistic than maybe some of our own higher ups.
You know, I have a lot of friends that are natives, and I have a great friend that is a Hopi elder, Grandpa Maleva, and he shared some stories with me about the Star People and how they actually moved the Hopi and into different planets during certain, like right before cataclysmic events. Yes. And that's the knowledge that was passed on. And there's a lot of phenomena that he has also shared with me via video footage, like just weird stuff happens around him on a regular basis. And I can't tell if they're like 1 second, this video he sent me one time, this thing was rotating during the daytime, maybe 20 feet off, 15 feet off the ground. And it was just spinning. It was about the size of a Volkswagen Bug. And it was just spinning, outskirts of Phoenix, Sun City. And it was like changing colors and doing all this weird stuff. And some of the stuff he sends me, it'll go from like physical form and then it'll manifest into something else. And so it appears there's also these entities that can shapeshift in front of us into a point of like different objects, almost like it's not physical, like they're just tricksters almost. I don't know how to explain it, but some of that seems to be prevalent in these sightings also. What are your thoughts?
I missed a section of that because you froze at your end. But yes, phenomena I talk about in my book, Echoes of Eden. And I love the fact that you've shared something of that Hopey story, because again, if we listen at the grassroots layer of human experience, if we listen to the folkloric layer, we listen to traditional story, we have all the elements of contact story going on, but it's not this terror, exploitation, machinization, World War III kind of scenario. It is far intimate and finessed contact with human beings that represents a real concern for us and the kind of lives we're living, the kind of potential we're fulfilling. And I think that help is as much present today as it's ever been. If I thought that our visitors were only in conversation with covert politicians and military intelligence, I'd be worried, because I wouldn't think they'd be getting a very rounded picture as to what's going to help us all. But the fact all this other contact is going on and is accelerating, has accelerated over recent decades, that's where I think, oh, good. I think they're a bit smarter than that. And I think they love us better than that to hand us over to the forces of darkness, so to speak.
It's a duality, man. It's like every action has an opposite and equal reaction. Yin, yang, black, white, up, down, left, right. It's just this certainly there needs to be balance, because if one side became greater than the other, then it would eventually consume the other side and then itself. And my theory here. But the problem
is that following that hearing, a lot of people, if they were being introduced to the possibility of contact through that hearing last year, they would come away believing that we should be deeply worried about all ETs because they represent an existential threat to us, and we need to arm ourselves so we can learn to shoot them out of the sky, since we can't do that at this point. And there was a whole chain of questions from Congressman Andy Ogles and Tim Burchett that framed the whole topic of contact in that way. And that was a big motivator for me in writing The Invasion of Eden, to say, no, if we frame contact in that militaristic way, well, good luck to us, because we're not going to come out very well if we turn it into a fist fight or a gunfight. And no, that's not the nature of contact. There may be demographics who have no interest in human beings. They're just interested in a staging point in the solar system or resources that our planet has to offer. But that's just a fragment of the picture. And we need the whole picture if we're to have an intelligent conversation about how to move forward within and among the community of spacefaring civilizations.
Yeah. And Paul, let me ask you this. You've probably read Enki and Ninmah, that ancient Sumerian tablet where Enki gets woken up in the Great Abzu, and then he's told he needs to make a replacement for the gods because they're working too hard. So he's like, all right, I'll do it. And then he goes and starts drinking beers with Ninmah. And Ninmah's like, okay, for everything you do, I will counterbalance that. So they're drinking beers and they're making people and they're making mistakes along the way. And then there's this one part that talks about how Enki, he got Ninmah pregnant, right? He's like, well, let's try this. Instead of just getting the clay from, instead of just using clay and making people, let's use you. And baby's born, child's born. I'm wondering if that's the tablet that's describing people before Adam and Eve in the Genesis stories, And like they're making like, oh well, this one can't stand upright. This one's an idiot. What do we do with this one? Oh, give him to the king. Oh, that's where politicians came from. I get it. But they're trying to make these beings that can do the work for them. And then finally, Enki gets Ninmah pregnant, and she has a child. Is that where they got the bloodlines from? Like, is that where the original hybrids, or what we refer to as hybrids, come from? Like, maybe some humans were made via cloning technologies, and then other ones were made through literally the goddess of the Anunnaki?
That's a really interesting question, because the story of human origins, whether you're following the Anunnaki story or the story of the feathered serpents or the story of the Elohim in the Bible, is really messy. And it's a much longer process and a more complex story than you might expect to find. And I think I say that because we are used to having ancient story written to glorify someone or other. Well, no one comes out of the Anunnaki stories looking good and looking like a hero. It's very messy. Similarly, in the Mayan
Except for Enki. And Enki's usually the one that's like, all right. Like, for example, when Inanna decided to go to the netherworld, he's like, all right, I'll get her out. You remember? And Enlil was like, no way.
But he doesn't get everything right.
No.
And it's a long process of experimentation, and I wonder if when we listen to Enki. So it's not exactly a story told to glorify him as such, even if we think actually he's on the positive side here. I was about to say the parallels with the Mayan story, where they have this long process of experimentation that predates Homo sapiens. Because we're told very clearly in the Mayan story that the experimentation resulted in us plus the apes, or us plus the ape-like creatures that live in the forest. So they're doing stuff before apes and Homo sapiens to get the kind of species they want. In the Mayan story, they have a species that's too advanced, that they can't manage and control, because these humans have precognition, future vision, far sight, better telepathic connection, better empathic connection, and they can't manage them. I mean, how can you ambush people who know when you're coming? How can you trick people who know what you're thinking? And so they have an emergency meeting of, well, can we dumb them down so we have a species that can just work for us and bring us our food and be not much smarter than that? And that's us. Again, not a story to glorify us.
Well, not you and me. I mean, we avoided that.
Of course. Although the silver lining to that story is that absent of the vapor that Quetzalcoatl came up with, sprayed over human populations, we are still smart. So the take home of the story is get your atmosphere clean, get your food and water clean, and your brain will work a whole lot better. And that take home is in stories from Africa, from ancient Greece, around the world. And then we come back to the Anunnaki stories. And it is interesting what you're suggesting, different strands of human being with different roles to play. Yes, I think there's something to that. But the bit of the story that's always grabbed me is how they come up with the rank and file of the human population, because they get that from the blood of Kingu, if you remember. So that's Anunnaki blood. And I say blood, I mean, this is all language to describe genetic engineering. And this is a story written by human beings thousands of years before us. So we shouldn't get too precious about the technical detail. Maybe it was blood, maybe it wasn't. But the message is they're fusing something of themselves with something of us to produce the desired effect. And to produce the rank and file, the working class, they get the blood of Kingu, who is a sky person, but he's at the bottom of the pile. He's the one they were able to overpower. He's the one they were able to defeat. And that is just about the compromise they want. Intelligence, but overcomable. Intelligence, but defeatable. That's what we want. And so that's where we come from. And the question about where do those bloodlines go? That's also a really good question. And I think the Sumerian Kings list raises that question quite neatly, because we begin with kings whose lifespans tell us these are not human beings. These are Anunnaki kings. And then there's a crossover king called Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is one of these hybrids that you mentioned. So he's human like us, but with a bit more Anunnaki in him than the rest of us.
Do you think he was King Og?
So
Sorry to interrupt, but do you think he was King Og referred to in the biblical texts?
No, I think Og was someone else, but just that's again a great question, because they are both anomalous people and they are both really tall. And again, it suggests a different bloodline, a bit more ET in them than the rest of us. Gilgamesh, that's who he is. And then he's succeeded by more of a mixture of kings. And by the end of the list, it's all human kings living normal lifespans and having normal reigns. And so what that crossover story suggests is that who the human kings were was very carefully controlled. And all through the ages, you listen to stories around royalty, and it's to do with protecting the royal bloodline so they don't mix with ordinary human beings, so that they don't dilute that blue blood that they're all carrying. Well, what is all that about? And that concern to keep royal blood pure has created a lot of problems through the ages. I mean, if you go back to the period of the 1500s, the kings and queens of Europe looked very odd because of all the inbreeding that had gone on, trying to keep the blood pure. So they had to get a bit smarter about it at some point. But where does the idea come from? And I do wonder if it goes back to the handover stories or even a handover moment where the non-human governors of the past said, okay, we want human beings who can really be here in our stead. So it can't be from the rank and file. It's got to be from a different tier of humanity. And I think what you're suggesting is credible when we go back to the ancient texts, that it was a different aspect of this whole period of experimentation from the very beginning.
Man, I got to read some more of this Mayan scriptures and teachings because this is fascinating. Now, when you talked about the Mayan scriptures describing a people that were created greater than their creators, so they had to like basically get rid of them and suppress them, that's just like the secret book of John, where the archons made man in their image, and then in doing so, they made him greater than they were. So they're like, oh, beep. What are we going to do now? This guy's better than we are. So what did they do? Well, they created a different body and put him in this different body. And I thought to myself, what if there was a time like they made this just perfect light body that was fully activated and it could actually go from the fourth and third dimension and actually transfer to light, so move at the speed of light. And as you had mentioned earlier, this precognition that many of us have, this intuition that many of us have, what if there was a time before the fall of Babylon where everybody basically was telepathic, and then something happens to the earth, and those that survive they don't have this telepathic connection. Maybe it has something to do with the atmosphere. Maybe it has something to do with the genetics. But remember, we all used to be we all spoke the same language, and then something happened, and then we don't understand each other anymore. What if that's the missing link?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned something to do with the atmosphere, because that's in the Mayan story, and it's in the Hawaiian story of the Mo'o. So the Mayans say we used to have a clean atmosphere, and then Quetzalcoatl came up with this vapor that when sprayed over human populations dumbs us all down. The Mo'o version of that story is there used to be more oxygen in the atmosphere, and that when there was more oxygen, we were healthier and more of our brains were working. So we had these higher cognitive powers. So that's an interesting white rabbit to follow.
Well, and it makes me think about the zombies in the Bible. When the zombies are like, what happens if the atmosphere, the sun does something, there's some type of magnetic flip and people's brains just start freaking out, and they like literally the synapses start tweaking out. Could be. But you know what? That's okay, because I'm in Southern Colorado. Come on down, Paul. We'll hang out. We'll be watching the zombies from 12,000 feet elevation, man. It'll be amazing. Okay. Side note, I got to ask, when you, this is fascinating. This is like Matrix kind of stuff here. So I've picked up an additional 9 to 5 for a little while. You know, I'm learning some new trades. I'm making some money, and we're putting it back into Leak Project to keep things nice and smooth and fluid here. And I'm at work, and I meet these people from Turkey, and they're amazing. And I'm like, wow, you guys are from Turkey? That's really cool. And then a few days later, I'm driving home from work, and a wild turkey flies into my windshield at about 55 miles an hour. It's like hitting a freaking cannonball. If I didn't have my glasses on, I would probably be blind. And I'm not exaggerating. I was pulling shards out of my face, thousands of pieces of glass. So wild turkey. It's a wild turkey, right? And then my friend Diamond and I go find these petroglyphs in Crow Canyon, and he finds an empty bottle of wild turkey. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. And then somebody says in my post, Rex, did you know that Matt LaCroix has discovered this incredible anomaly and this artifact in Turkey? And him and Paul are talking about what's going on in Turkey. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And I'm working on a screenplay right now. And a part of the screenplay is the underground city in Turkey. And then I'm like, wow. And then the people came back to my work a few days after, and they bought something from me. And they're like, yeah, we're from Turkey. So, and then I'm talking to you, and then there's something going on with Turkey. So what's going on? This is awesome.
Yeah, Turkey is a place that really merits far more attention and study. The history that is carried in that country is extraordinary and phenomenally important. In the Invasion of Eden, I think it's in chapter 2 that we go to Turkey, and we spend 2 chapters there just looking at one object and the information carried by that object. Next month, I'm going to Turkey with Matt LaCroix and others, and we're going to be going to 4 sites to examine artifacts that have been found there to assess how they speak to the story of humanity and the story of civilization. Turkey is interesting for so many reasons. It's a place of many, many firsts. One of the earliest, oldest languages on the planet is spoken in that part of the world. Classical writers from the Greek and Roman period acknowledge that the Iron Age began there. Human beings began to build with stone there. Human beings learned to farm there 10,000 years ago. So that's the leap into agriculture that has produced civilization as we know it. Not the first civilization on Earth, but the current one begins in Turkey. There are other firsts there as well, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm not the first person to say we need to go to Turkey and understand the human story from the perspective of that country. Abraham, I argue, came from Turkey, not from Lower Mesopotamia, but from Turkey. Turkey, of course, is where the Bible says the ark ended up. This is the Ark of Noah / Archahasis, Yusudra, Utnapishtim. So the Bible is saying that the world was repopulated from Turkey, and that's been the local law there for a very, very long time. So there are all these firsts there that I think ought to grab our attention. And I'm going there because I believe that the glyphs to be found carved into basalt in some cases. I mean, how with Iron Age technology you're going to carve these beautiful reliefs into basalt, one of the hardest stones known to man, I don't know. But suffice it to say, it would take a big commitment. So you know the information on that basalt is really important for their culture and all the cultures that would follow. So what's the information? What was it that they wanted future civilizations to know? And I'll keep my powder dry and say I share some of that in the Invasion of Eden, but more of that is going to unfold in the movie that I'm putting together with Matt, helmed by Matt LaCroix. So watch this space for what we discover and what we bring to film.
Dude, that's awesome. I need to get out there. That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. The errata civilization, and whether or not this is true or just mythology, the Inanna's descent to the netherworld describes when she actually leaves a certain capital in Turkey for, I think, Iraq. And if you look at the Sumerian king list, you can date that back to approximately 29,500 years ago, which is incredible.
Yeah,
So,
which is so that's prior to the last ice age, and that's part of what we're interested in the timelines around these stories. Another very interesting vector that points to Turkey is Norse story. Many of the stories we know about Odin in particular, but really about all the kings, the Aesir of the Norse tradition, we know because a chieftain wrote the stories down in the 1200s. This was a man called Snorri Sturluson. And he argued that Odin was one of an advanced race. And what does that mean? Why were they so advanced? Why did they have technological abilities that human society at large didn't have? Doesn't answer that question, but he does say that their base was in what is now Turkey, and that the gods of the Norse stories came from Turkey. So you've got the gods of Norse stories. You've got Haldi of the higher people who've lived in the high country there. You've got the Abrahamic peoples whose stories begin there. Potentially, you've got everybody's stories who begin there if we're going to trace them from Atrahasis/Noah. So these are the reasons that place has my interest and why I'm doing some digging.
you lucky duck. Keep me posted, man. Let's collaborate. And
Will do.
thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. We always have great podcasts. I got to say, this is probably my favorite, man. So super cool. Thank you.
I love talking to you. Your awareness, your understanding of these ancient stories is phenomenal. So I know I'm always going to have a great conversation with you, Rex, when I come on.
Right on. I will send you a check in the mail for the compliment. Thanks, right. Paul. You're awesome. Thank you very much for all that you do, and keep being the change the world needs to see.
Thanks, Rex. Look forward to next time.
Thank you very much. Oh, and folks, just wanted to real quick also let you know that you can find Paul's work at paulanthonywallis.com, youtube.com, The Fifth Kind, youtube.com, Paul Wallis, as well as fifthkind.tv, The Invasion of Eden. Get your copy today and get the series, the Eden series, the Eden Conspiracy. Be well.
Whoa, Paul, you are a legend, sir. This podcast is amazing. We have thousands of hours of unedited, uncensored content on our Patreon page. I'll leave the link in the video description box. Also, check out Paul Anthony Wallis at paulanthonywallis.com. I'll leave the link to his YouTube channel, The Fifth Kind, and get your copy today of The Invasion of Eden. Be excellent to each other, everybody. Hit the bell. Be well. Be the change you want to see. And I'll see you on Patreon. Na, na, na.